Hey everybody, Scott Colbranson, host of Rock Mysteries. Thanks for being back with us. We've got another great episode for you coming right up. Before we do that, though, a reminder, we are a commercial-free podcast. That means we depend fully and only on your support and contribution. So check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/Rock Mysteries, where you can get exclusive content, some swag, and one-on-one interactions you can't get. And most of all, you get the episodes early. That's right. Before the general public, our Patreon supporters get early access to every episode of Rock Mysteries. So check us out, patreon.com/Rock Mysteries. Thanks. Anthony Gonzalez, a kid from Queens, New York, grew up loving and playing baseball. With a loving mother and sister, he was abandoned by his father and found solace in his music as he got older. Gonzalez morphed into Johnny Thunders, and his band, the New York Dolls, set New York on fire in the mid and early 1970s. Although their career was short-lived, the influence of Johnny Thunders can be felt today in rock and roll music and throughout the 70s and 80s. But Johnny Thunders also had a downside. Despite being influential in the world of music and with guitar players and songwriters, he had an addiction to heroin that would end up killing him, alone in a New Orleans hotel room. Is there a mystery about the death of Johnny Thunders? We'll ask and talk to author Nina Antonia, the official biographer of Johnny Thunders, as we explore yet another rock mystery. Nina Antonia now joins us. She is an author who has chronicled the lives and careers of Johnny Thunders and the New York Dolls, and is the author of the authorized Johnny Thunders biography, In Cold Blood, which you can, of course, pick up on Amazon.com and other places as well. She's appeared in numerous documentaries on the subject as well. You can follow her on Twitter at Nina Antonia 13, and you can also visit her website at ninaantoniaauthor.com. Nina, thanks for joining us here on Rock Mysteries.
Hello, it's good to be talking to you.
All right. So, Nina, I have to start with this, right? Because I think as writers, we often write about subjects as we're interested in, or something that's compelling that calls us to write about it. Nina, tell us first how you connected with New York Dolls, and of course, later Johnny Thunders, and this whole story and the whole fascinating background on the music scene at that time.
God, that's a lot of questions in one. Well, I mean, I connected with the New York Dolls like any kid that loves rock and roll. I saw a picture of them in 16 magazine. They were doing a freak rock special. People were calling, well, glam wasn't yet born, so just before people were calling it freak rock, and that included the Stooges in that little nutshell. And so I saw a picture of the New York Dolls, and I thought they were the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And when you're that age, I could almost hear the rock and roll just looking at that picture. And I thought that Johnny was just looked amazing out of all of them. But I very much, my first rock and roll hero was Mort Bolan, and I could hear his influence in the New York Dolls. I loved their music. I loved the sort of chaos and passion of it. And I sort of promised myself that when on my 13th birthday that I would one day meet Johnny Thunders.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you started off as a fan, and that to me is where so many of our journeys start when it comes to music. And I know for me, back in the day when we read magazines. I feel bad for my kids who don't have that same sort of discovery when you get to pick up a magazine or you go to the record store on Tuesday release day and wait for them to unwrap the box and take off that shrink wrap and open up the vinyl. Although now people are finding vinyl again, which is a good thing. But so you come to be a fan, New York Dolls, you see all that, and of course the Mark Bolan connection, absolutely. The Dolls and Johnny really had a massive and I think just ongoing influence, not only on the punk scene at the time, of course, in the 70s and early 80s, but also just rock music past that. You can go up to the Guns N' Roses and even some of the newer bands that you're hearing today. One of my favorite bands, The Replacements, of course, I think built their whole kind of mystique around Johnny's mystique. But when you look at that influence, the Dolls never got to the point of commercial success that so many of the other bands have. But a lot of the people who did credit them for this. That influence, how deep is that influence by the New York Dolls and of Johnny too, who we're going to talk about more in depth here in a few minutes? How deep is that from music from that point in time to now?
Well, I think you've just summarized it. But I also think that some people are doomed in a way almost to, they're so pioneering that they influence what's coming up for the next 30, 40 years. And to the people who know of them, they are absolutely revered, but they are so ahead of the game that it's in fact the copyists that tend to make it. It's not very good parallel, but you know that book that Madonna did called Sex?
Yes.
Okay, so I saw something online and they were going on, oh, it's really groundbreaking, and she's using leather and she's using black guys, she's using white guys. And that book to me is basically a softer version of all of Robert Mapplethorpe's images. So if you don't know what comes before, you end up crediting actually the copyists. And it's then up to the copyists whether they are kind of graceful enough to say, well, my big influence was Johnny Thunders. Most people are quite verbal about that. Some people do go out and check Johnny out, and some people don't. Some people don't go that deep. They're not interested in going that deep.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think there's this school of thought, and they call it it's a biblical reference, but they call it the Moses effect, which is of course going back to the story of the Bible. Moses leads the Israelites right to the Promised Land, but he never is able to go in or to get there. And I think that this is the same kind of premise, which is there's so many folks in the arts, and you talked about Mapplethorpe, and you now talked about Johnny Thunders and the Dolls and music. Is they completely reinvent something, or they do something differently than anybody ever has, and they change the trajectory of an entire art form, but they never get to see the fruits of their labor, which is really fascinating.
But that's how it is, and I do think for the people that discovered Johnny, just like the people that discovered the Dolls, it was a real awakening. I mean, it definitely kick-started punk in the UK, and although it sounds kind of simplified to say that one night we were all watching the Old Grey Whistle Test, and from Morrissey to the Clash, well, to the people that would be in the Clash, to the people that would be in the Sex Pistols, we were all galvanized by it. But we were galvanized by it because music, or rock and roll music at that point, seemed kind of stale. And people like the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin were, to a 15, 16-year-old, they were old men.
Yeah.
You need, you need people that can kind of speak your language or understand what you're going through at that point in time. And that's what the Dolls gave us, disenfranchised kids across the UK. I think the other thing that's very interesting in regards to Johnny, and it's taken me a while to realize that not all of his American audience realized just how big and influential he was in Europe and in Japan as well. He's not just considered an American artist, he's an international artist.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's what I think your book does such a great job of chronicling and talking about. It really is because it's his authorized biography, and it's also sort of the Johnny Thunders Bible in my view, because you can go in there and you can find so much information, and you really outline well how much of an influence he had across the globe and how that changed the course. Even artists like David Bowie, who saw him perform, and then suddenly you saw him introduce some of the things from the New York Dolls into his own act and kind of morph it into, and again, David Bowie's one of the greatest, but still, again, the influence from everything from stage wear to the music to guitar playing. Johnny doesn't get the credit that an Eric Clapton or an Eddie Van Halen or all these other guitar heroes get, but you can see and hear his sound and even music that's coming out from younger people today.
I mean, I know. I mean, Bowie was a particularly good point, and he was very clever in what he chose. And I think he was a great artist. But I don't know if you've read the New York Dolls book. There's a really funny bit in it where Sylvain says, "Oh yeah, he really liked our shoes. He was asking us where we got our shoes made." And next thing you know, he sort of toggled to Max's Kansas City wearing a pair.
Yes. Yes. No, exactly. And that book is also awesome. And yes, the stories are fascinating, especially for those of you who might be new or have discovered these artists like Johnny himself. Now go back and read both of those books, because I think they're great together. So Nina, we talk about Johnny Gonzalez himself, right? So Johnny Thunders, that's his real name. And you talk about in the book his childhood and the fact that his dad leaves when he's very young, and that has a profound effect on his entire life. But he grew up somewhat of a normal childhood in some ways. You talk about him in his affinity to play baseball in New York. He grew up in Queens, so he was obviously a big baseball fan. But what about his childhood and that abandonment from his father, the feelings of abandonment? How did that put him on the course of his life that ended up in, unfortunately, his early demise?
Oh, okay. You are asking big questions, aren't you? I suppose you have to.
I try, Nina. I try.
What do we know? Well, we know that Johnny's father abandoned him and the mother, and that mum had to work two jobs, and Johnny was mostly left in the care of his older sister, Marianne, and that he was very much loved, but there was financial struggle there, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the sort of themes in Johnny's music, particularly the song that's considered his greatest, "You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory," is loss and abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
And he very sadly repeated that cycle of loss and abandonment with his own children. And it also meant, I think, that he was quite needy in his love relationships, because if I experienced this as well, if somebody that you love and depend on is there 1 minute and then they just go the next, and you're a child, that just completely destabilizes you.
Yeah, it does. And to me, that's I find, not all, of course, Nina, but I find in reading Johnny's story and having and researched so many other musicians and artists, is that drives them to create amazing art that they do. But there's also that duality, right? The duality of the pain, which leads to the creativity. For Johnny himself and that childhood and where it leads him into music eventually. But even early on in his life, the substance abuse that would become so attached to him later in life, especially around heroin, isn't there at the beginning. What was the inflection point where he turned from somebody who was interested in music, was driven to do this, to then getting a taste, unfortunately, of heroin, and then that leading into the spiral which took him down that rabbit hole?
Johnny happened to be very good at is it baseball, basketball? I mean, no, it's baseball, isn't it?
Baseball,
Yeah,
baseball.
And he was scouted for the Little League, which was really, really a big deal. And he wanted to go to everything that it entailed. But even today, this is the case. They expect the father to be involved, to take the kid to things. I don't know what dads in baseball do, but it meant that Johnny could not proceed. And it must have really, really hurt, because you want to be just like everybody else. And he was very good at baseball. And in fact, when I went to Queens, I met his old baseball coach. that was very moving because he was, by that point, the old baseball coach was in his 80s and he was in a wheelchair, but he spoke so fondly of Johnny, just saying how good he'd been and what a sweet kid he'd been. But because of that lack of a father, that was the first dream that was dashed. I mean, imagine how different it would have been if he'd been able to pursue that. He would never, I don't think, have gone near drugs. The need wouldn't have been there if he'd have had the father, but who knows?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I found that story incredible in the book about that because having sons of my own and having had them play baseball and soccer and sports, you especially back then in the '60s, you're talking about a much different time. Today, there's a lot of single parent households, so things have changed a little bit. But back then, you're right. There was this need and requirement for people to have a father or someone there to make sure that they could play on, and Johnny couldn't do that because his father wasn't there. Now that transition. So at what point does he then say, okay, well, he can no longer go on with his baseball dream, which to your point had to be just crushing for him. He discovers music though, and what was it about music that Johnny found solace and maybe an outlet in?
Oh, yeah. Well, but when he was like discovering music and everything, it was the kind of, I guess, the height of rock and roll, wasn't it? So the Stones at Madison Square Garden, and there's all this debate. I mean, you can see him in the crowd wearing, it looks like sort of a cherry red jacket and fluffing up his hair. And he also came to London with his girlfriend, and saw Tyrannosaurus Rex. And he told me that when we were, I mean, it's in the book, but he did mention it when we were walking past the house where Mort Bolan had lived. So I live in the neighborhood where Mort Bolan spent a lot of time. But anyway, I've digressed. Johnny came of age in that particular golden moment of rock and roll when everything was moving forward and the Stones and Keith were godlike and all the rest of it. And it seemed like a non-stop party.
Yeah, and it was interesting, even going back to some of the, and I am jumping around a little bit here too, because it triggers some of the memories from reading your book around when Johnny was in the hospital and he was impersonating Elvis Presley for all the nurses. He was someone who really did, and you can hear it in his music throughout his career, right? Which is that influence of sort of the Gene Vincents, the Elvis Presleys, all the kind of, and the R&B too. So the Motown stuff as well. So his interest in music was genuine. And at that time, to your point, rock and roll, R&B, all of those things that were sort of in their golden era. And it certainly is reflected in his music.
I mean, he was obviously somebody that wanted the adulation, and in some ways he was very confident, and in other ways he wasn't. Apparently the first few New York Dolls gigs that he did, he had to turn away from the audience. He was so shy he couldn't face them.
Yeah, that amazed me, and I've actually, a lot of other musicians have been in that same boat where they would play with their back to the audience because of that. And Johnny too, when you do see the interviews with him that are filmed one-on-one, you can sense that kind of that unease with the attention and sort of that shyness that comes out for someone who's known for being such an influence in rock music. But as he progresses, we get past the New York Dolls, and he gets then of course creates the band the Heartbreakers, which was a phenomenal band and another underrated band. But he again is kind of beset by, if you want to call it, bad luck. Things just don't seem to work out. How much of that and the inability for Johnny to kind of take that next step to where he got the recognition and the success commercially was due to his own actions or other outside pressures that happened around him?
Back a bit, because he I mean, the drugs, using hard drugs, did enter into the picture. He was in the New York Dolls, and they seem to have entered into the picture after he really got heavily into speed. So it would have helped him come down. There was far less education about drugs and the pitfalls of them. And he was a big fan of Keith Richards. I think in there, his friend Gail Higgins Smith, who became the tour manager of the Heartbreakers, was saying that he kept Keith's cigarette butt when they were in some bar and Richards was in there. So yeah, he was a rock and roll fan. The other thing is, unfortunately, opiates, heroin do kind of nullify any difficult, painful feelings that you're going through. The other tipping point may have been that the Dolls were very close, and the first drummer, Billy Mercier, died. Right. And that was something that Sylvain said he didn't think Johnny ever kind of got over that. That was another, not that he meant it, but another sudden abandonment.
Yeah, but Nina, that also that change in drummers, I'm glad you brought that up with the Dolls, introduces him to Jerry Nolan, and Jerry Nolan becomes sort of like a pseudo father figure to him, right? And because he's older, he's the oldest member of the Dolls, if I recall correctly. And
he's 7 years older than Johnny.
What's that?
He was 7 years old.
7 years, yeah. So really, a male figure that he could look up to. And again, going back to your point about his childhood and his father and the abandonment issue. So Jerry Nolan kind of fills that void for him. But Jerry Nolan also introduced him to opiates, correct?
As far as I know, but I think there was other people around them. There was some kind of tour manager as well. So it's not fair really to say it was Jerry Nolan, because unfortunately in that time and place, drugs were everywhere. They were like cups of tea to the English.
Yeah, no, we as part of the show we did on Bon Scott, we learned that about the London scene during that kind of mid 70s to early 80s scene, from the punk scene to the rock, everything that was going on there, and the ubiquitousness of heroin and drugs period was huge. So totally understand that. So let's then take up this conversation. And I know I'm skipping some stuff, but we want to get to a little bit here of Johnny as he progresses and then gets later in his career, and is out on his own, and leading up to the unfortunate demise of Johnny on April 23rd, 1991. But he kind of skips around, and then he finds himself sort of on his own and releases his solo album.
I just wanted to say something, because one of the unfortunate things that has become repeated wisdom, even though it's untrue, is people will say, oh, the Heartbreakers introduced heroin to the London punk scene. But heroin was already here. It was flourishing. And the other thing, very sadly, is that Sid Vicious's mother was the one who introduced him to heroin.
Yes.
And you have a parent who's using, and you see that as somehow they're telling you that makes them feel better, that again becomes a huge influence. So it's just too wrong and simplistic to say, oh, it was Johnny, it was the Heartbreakers. No, I'm sorry, it's a wider remit than that. And shocking that I've seen people who have parents that are addicted, they either go one way or the other. They either never touch drugs or they fall all into it, and it's very sad.
Yeah, it's very sad. And you're right, though. That's the example they see. And so they either rail against it or they just dive right into it. And so we see Johnny on his own after 78, and he builds his career from there. On
his own, though, because he kept gigging with the Heartbreakers. That was their bread and butter money.
And he kind of goes through that. And I think there's times when I read the story in your biography where you feel like he's on the cusp of breaking through, and then something happens. And that seems to be kind of a repeating factor throughout his life. And I know we talked about it a little while ago about kind of how much of that was him, how much of that was just circumstance. The one thing too that stuck out to me, Nina, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but Johnny seemed, just based on how you describe him, the conversations and his actions, seemed to be just a really accepting person. So when people asked him for help or they wanted to be involved with him, he sort of welcomed them in, and a lot of times that ended up biting him, didn't it?
Yes, I think it probably did. I mean, but he did kind of change, towards the end of his life. He was definitely do as I say, not as I do.
Mm.
He would hate to see people getting onto drugs because by then he knew the pitfalls of it. I mean, something else kind of changed between those golden days of rock and roll to the sort of 1978, 1980s onwards, and that was that rock stars started jogging and getting healthy, and drugs were no longer sort of fashionable anymore, or they went out of fashion. And rightly or wrongly, Johnny was judged very harshly. I mean, there was, I read somewhere, it was in Punk magazine, they said that they hardly ever included Johnny in it because they wanted to make an example of him. But that's so crazy because they didn't make an example out of Dee Dee Ramone, who had just as much of a drug problem, or Iggy Pop. So I would say that they were probably picking on Johnny in that incident.
Yeah, and that's the thing that in researching this, reading your book, watching a few documentaries and interviews, was this kind of feeling that it was the same thing over and over again, which was sort of like, well, he was difficult to work with because he wasn't reliable, and that seems to become the kind of overreaching narrative. But yet there are other musicians that have had similar issues, but then you hear people talk glowingly about them because they're appreciated. Look, we're all human beings. We all have faults, and we all have positives and negatives. And it seems like we're starting to maybe get to a point in time where people are appreciating him more, but that narrative still is there, is it not? So this idea that he was just a mess to work with, and that even though he had some talent, and yeah, he deserves a little bit of credit, he was such a pain in the ass that it seems like that's what people focus on instead of what he offered and what he helped change through the course of his career.
I would have said only the people that didn't understand him. I mean, I don't think he ever missed a single gig, apart from if it had been, I think there was an incident of a club owner saying that Johnny wasn't going to play when was going to play when he'd never agreed it. But he was like the hardest working man in rock and roll at one point.
Yeah.
He did as many gigs as James Brown. He showed up to all of them because if he didn't, then he wouldn't have had the money to pay for his lifestyle. He had to.
Yeah.
So he worked really hard. He didn't get to have long months off or to recuperate. And I think probably that was one of the reasons why he did die young, because he couldn't address his health issues or have a good rest or put his feet up.
Yeah, it never seemed like he got that time to reflect and to recover, right, at different times. And I know that other times he tried to change his habit and tried to get off the drugs, but that they weren't always successful. They were successful at times, but we see that kind of repeating over and over again.
He went to rehab once towards the end of his life, and he was really in a bad way. And he did that with the encouragement of some friends and fans, and he did that for his sister as well, because his sister and mother really loved him, and they were at their wits' end. I think one of the other fallacies I see is and it's why I stopped going on Facebook and looking at the Johnny Sanders sites, no matter how good they are, is because people talk such misdirected nonsense, really. He was very loved. His Swedish girlfriend that he had a baby with, Suzanne, was really a decent person and would have stayed with Johnny always, except his behavior got out of hand. He was not able to tame his demons, because that's something only we can do for ourselves, isn't it? Nobody else can make you stop. You have to want to.
Absolutely. There's no, you can try to help as much as you can, but you're right. You have to make the conscious choice to make that change. And you mentioned that, so he has his daughter, right? So his third child, that later in life with the Swedish hairdresser, I believe she was.
Yes, yes, they
Yes.
had a girl called Jamie, who's now a very grown-up girl, and I've met one of the grandchildren, which was
Oh,
lovely. But I mean, it's very poignant because her eyes were just like Johnny's, and he would
oh.
have looked at his grandchildren.
Yeah, no, I did read about her and that she had children as well. So that's a great continuation of that story. But he has the baby then, and that he kind of I wouldn't call it he got rest then, but he sort of was so in love with being a father again and having his daughter Jamie. And then that sort of breaks down. He goes back to the United States, right? And I remember his wife mentioning, or his girlfriend mentioning, that she felt that that would be the last time she would see him. And sure enough, that turned out to be the case, unfortunately.
I just going to say, I realized once his German manager left, Christopher,
Hmm.
um, who was a stabilizing influence, who's another father figure, and once Johnny broke up with Suzanne, I mean, I also felt that he wouldn't last much longer because they'd been his safety net and his support, really.
No, and I got that sense from your book as well that that was the case. But he heads back to the United States, and then at some point he's diagnosed with leukemia. How much did you know about that? Did anybody really know about that?
He splits up with Suzanne and he goes back to live in New York. He gets an apartment, but he can't really hold it together, even though he told me
Mm.
he thought it was very funny because it was almost opposite a police station. But his health starts to go downhill. Jerry still remains in his life, and he goes to see Jerry, and he says that he doesn't understand what all these bumps and bruises are on him. And at that point, Jerry's girlfriend, whose mother had died of leukemia, she suggests that maybe Johnny should go into hospital. And Jerry says, "I will stay with you all the way. Let's do this. Maybe cancel the gigs you've got in Japan." And I know this because Jerry came to see me the summer before he died. So
Mm.
he was telling me all of this. I was very grateful to him, and it's terribly sad, but Johnny said what he would always say to Jerry, which was thanks, but no thanks, because he was scared of going into hospital. And also
Mm.
because, very sadly, and especially in America, but it happens here as well, that doctors are judgmental of people that are drug
Mm.
users.
Yeah.
No matter how ill they are, they'll see junkie first and think that it is some sort of scam. But in fact, Johnny was very ill. So it's absolutely tragic.
Yeah, that's terrible. And I you did mention that in the book, that story of Jerry talking about how he didn't want to go to the doctor, and so then it was never technically diagnosed. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we have to wait for the coroner's report, which
Yeah.
it's in the coroner's report.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. No. And that's where we'll jump ahead. And I know we're jumping ahead, Nina, here just because obviously of the duration of the program. Because Johnny's life and your book, again, I want people to go read your book because it's fascinating, and the spots we're skipping over are important. But I do think people need to go and research more because I think his life and the way you chronicled it is fascinating, and it really does give the most insight into the man and his life and his contribution to us all as music fans and as fans of art. So, but let's jump ahead to that. So you talk about this situation where he was not feeling good. He was having issues. He goes to Jerry. Then he finds himself in New York. Then he ends up going to New Orleans, right? So in 1991, he's in New Orleans.
He's very unwell, but he has gigs to do in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
He was absolutely adored in Japan. And so he does those shows. He sees I believe he saw a doctor there, I think. There was some thoughts as to whether he should carry on with the gigs. He looked so fragile if you look at footage of him. And then he was backwards and forwards. He goes to Germany. Then he goes to New Orleans because he had always wanted to do some sort of New Orleans style musical review. So, but I also think that perhaps he was, the way that cats go off to die somewhere, they're not known, they just go off in private.
Yes.
So I think he did have a sense that time was running out, and he was supposed to be joined later on by Stevie Classon and by Jerry Nolan, but they weren't with him at the beginning. And Johnny was not used to being by himself. He usually always had somebody with him, and he didn't cope very well by himself either.
Yeah, and so he finds himself, like you said, and you do talk about that through the book too, right? About how the need for him to be around and to have people involved in his life on a daily basis that he could depend on, and so he finds himself in New Orleans, and so the events around April 23rd, 1991, the official story from the police department is that he dies of a drug overdose.
Suspected overdose, yes. People said that at the beginning, and people still say it now. In the coroner's report, it says that there was, I think, heroin and methadone in Johnny's body, but it's very clear that it is not enough to kill him.
Correct. Yes, it was. It said, the coroner's report said cocaine and methadone. Correct. Yeah.
But there's not enough for him to die of an overdose, even though journalists are still saying that to this day, as if there is no background, there's no documentary, there's no book. You can keep paraphrasing inaccuracies, and people love to believe inaccuracies.
You're right. You're right. And so, the day he passes away, though, all of these things, these stories that go around about other people being there and all that stuff. What if through your research, and even Dee Dee Ramone in his biography talked about him being mixed up with some people, and like you said, he was only there a very short time. What through all of your research and your conversations, sort of what is the truth there, so that we can set the record straight?
Okay, with all due respect, Dee Dee Ramone wasn't there either. His and Johnny's sister, Marianne, got a detective involved. What do we know? We know that Johnny was very ill. We know that in the coroner's report it says it appears that he has leukemia and that's not an overdose. So what's the mystery? If there's any mystery, it is that people either knew that he was dying and didn't call an ambulance, and that they ransacked his room when he was dead.
Yeah, that's sort of what your book gets to. And I wonder too, that his sister, and this kind of call, even going back to Mark Webster, his former manager, talking about trying to reopen the case. What was that about?
What was what about?
The fact that they were asking for the case to be reopened from the New Orleans Police Department.
That was Johnny's sister.
Yes.
Had asked that, and Mick Webster, the tour manager, just conveyed that to the press at the time, because she felt that everything had been brushed under the carpet too quickly. And that's probably true.
Yeah. And I think too, we find in some of these other shows that we've done about Kurt Cobain, about Bon Scott, where there was drug use involved, the police tend to overlook these things, or not, I shouldn't say overlook. They tend to rush through them because they say, oh, well, this person they'll call them a junkie or was addicted to some sort of substance, and they overlooked it. Do you think, was that something involved here? Do you think, is that what the family thought?
Yes, of course. I think Marianne says that in the book. She says the New Orleans police just rushed through it because they thought Johnny was just another junkie John Doe. But I think the coroner's report, it kind of does sum up some of it. We'll never know who stole from Johnny, but if you're looking for the mystery, that's the mystery. There was some lowlives around that probably stole his items, but he wasn't murdered. He was in too poor shape.
Right.
He died when he got there. He was dying. He looked ill. I think he had to have a medical before he was allowed on an airplane.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, there's always these conspiracy theories, and to your point you made earlier, especially with the proliferation of the internet now, people share all kinds of crazy stories, and certainly for us, the mystery here is more about what did happen in those final hours, and who was there, not because there was some sort of foul play, but just because they might not have rendered aid to him at a time when he needed it, or at least took advantage of the situation. Is that how you see it as well?
That's exactly how I see it. And it is, I do get a bit annoyed with people trying to soup it up into a big mystery, or
Hmm.
trying to get journalistic kudos by going, oh, this happened, that happened. With somebody like Johnny Thunders anyway, there's always a lot of sort of tall stories around. There was a lot of tall stories around Johnny for a short guy.
Yeah, no. Well, that's where we do with cultural icons, right? Is we build them into something, and then when they do either pass or something else happens, we tend to glamorize and take it to a different level. And then people who maybe discover Johnny later than in life, younger people, for example, they start to read these stories and these fanciful stories where people are trying to make money off it. They're trying to do all sorts of things because they know people are interested. But to me, the interest here for us, and the kind of mystery of Johnny Thunders is not some foul play story at the end of his life, because to your point, he was very, very sick. But the mystery of who he was, why he was the way he was, is much more, I think, the important story than how his life ended. Looking at him and knowing him, and writing so extensively about him over these years, Nina, what is it about Johnny that people who might be discovering him now for the first time, they might be listening to this show, they might be hearing the Heartbreakers or the New York Dolls for the very first time? For you, what is it that you would like them to know about Johnny, and what they should do to look more into him and to understand him?
Well, I was going to say, I think that in our pop culture iconography, people come along, whether it's Jesse James or whether it's James Dean, and Johnny kind of fits into that format. It's the glamorous outsider, isn't it?
Mm.
That they live their life on their own terms. And I think that's especially intriguing to any kid growing up now, because everything is so pinned down and worked out, and people I don't understand it. Maybe I shouldn't say this. People are so keen to identify themselves. So there's no real mystique or freedom left.
Yeah, and that you mentioned that about today, especially with kids who might be finding Johnny and his music for the first time, is the individuality and the desire to kind of forge their own way and do it their own way in a world where now you see kids and even adults on things like Instagram, where they're trying to edit everything that they do to make it look like it's perfect. And
Mm.
Johnny was anything but perfect, but he was himself.
But he was also deeply charismatic, and
Mm.
charisma is not something that you can learn, despite life coaches thinking you can. It's a certain form of electricity that people have within them, and it's very attractive to be around. I'm sure that Hendrix probably had it, and De Niro can evoke it in films, but Johnny actually had it. And it's when you know that there's somebody with a very sort of special presence there. He was incredibly electrifying on stage. That was his sort of, I don't know, that was where he shone as a performer, when he was having a good night. And people still say to me, oh God, I saw Johnny 40 years ago. I've never forgotten it. It was so intense. So it was like seeing the best gig you've ever wanted to see, and it was right there. But it also caused him to burn out, and the life of being a drug addict is a very, very hard one. It's 24/7, and it wears you out.
Yeah, there's a cautionary tale there, and I'll tell you, as much as I love live music, and there's a handful of people, obviously, that I would have loved to have seen, and one of them is Johnny, because love is music, but all of the reading, and in your book you talk about it too, is just how electric he was on stage and live. and that's something that unfortunately I missed. But you can still hear so many great stories about that, including in your book, Nina. Well, Nina, listen, I appreciate you spending so much time. If you want to talk to Nina, you can talk to her on Twitter at Nina Antonia 13. You can also visit her website, ninaantoniaauthor.com. Nina, before we let you go, though, I want you're a writer outside of music too. I'd love for people to know what you're up to now and what they can look forward to in some of your other works.
Oh, well, they need to come to my website. I mean, I basically stopped writing about rock and roll about 10 or so years ago. And I write more sort of supernatural and esoteric things because it's still marginalized and liminal places to explore. And really not much taken with the modern world and modern music. And I cringe in horror when I see the Kardashians. There's nothing alluring about being rich. I just can't see that at all.
I agree with you. But what talk about though? What are you working on now? Those books. Are you have anything coming out soon? People can take a look at your latest.
I've had a novel published called The Greenwood Fawn. I'm trying to get a new book deal for it. In Cold Blood is available only on Kindle, although it's just about to come out in Japan, Japanese edition.
Wow.
I would love for it to get a US publisher and a UK publisher. As I say, it's available on Kindle, for which I'm grateful, but it should be available on paper. And this July, it would have been Johnny's 70th birthday. So I don't know where the years have gone, but when he died, I sort of, a whole scene, I think, withered. It was really very, very sad, but I'm still grateful to be talking about Johnny, and I'm still grateful to be writing. And I'm hoping to record some poetry with Neil X and Chris Musto, and both of whom played Johnny.
Yes, that's very cool.
Yeah, Chris Musto was in the Oddballs, who was Johnny's last band, and Neil X was in Zig Zig Sputnik and did the odd gig with Johnny as well. So yeah, the circle is unbroken. We know who we are.
Well, Nina, I want to thank you for the time, and I'll tell you, you continue to do a great job of talking about Johnny and making sure that his legacy and who he was is told properly, instead of in ways that are made to make a cheap buck or to besmirch him. So thank you so much for doing that. We appreciate you being with us, and we'll keep in touch with you, and we look forward to reading your poetry and hearing much more about it.
It doesn't pay to try. All the smart boys know why. It doesn't mean I didn't try.
The sad end for Johnny Thunders does not diminish the impact he had on the world of music. Although his life was cut short, the music of the New York Dolls, the music of the Heartbreakers, the music and the style and the guitar playing, the musicianship of Johnny Thunders lives on. While today's younger generation might not be familiar, they can hear the influence of Johnny throughout popular music. And even though his life ended under strange circumstances, the only mystery around Johnny Thunders remains what could have been. For Rock Mysteries, I am Scott Gulbranson.